Prologue. Food chain. The African savannah stretched to the horizon, an ocean of gold and green that shimmered beneath the relentless sun. To the untrained eye, the landscape seemed serene, a tableau of nature's grandeur frozen in perfect harmony. But that was an illusion. Out here, peace was only a temporary pause between acts of violence. Life and death existed in a fragile equilibrium, governed not by morality, but by biology, by the immutable laws of survival etched into DNA over millions of years. Above the plains, the air vibrated with the drone of grasshopper buzzards, their dark silhouettes circling high against the cobalt sky. They were scavengers, patient sentinels of mortality, their behavior driven by algorithms older than civilization. To scientists, their presence was a statistical certainty. Where raptors hovered, death was imminent, or had already occurred. On a sandstone plateau overlooking the plains, a pride of lions lay sprawled beneath the skeletal shade of an acacia tree. They appeared inert, golden bodies blending with the tawny grasses, but appearances deceived. Every muscle, though still, was coiled in latent tension. The lion's yellow eyes scanned the horizon with the mechanical precision of optical sensors, tracking heat signatures, movement vectors. Predators evolved into perfect algorithms of predation. Two females lounged in the foreground, their ribs rising and falling in slow synchrony, while a massive male sat erect, his mane rippling in the dry wind like a ragged crown. His nostrils flared, drawing in the scents of the plain. Gazelle pheromones, the faint musk of zebra, the copper tang of distant blood. His genome, unchanged for 600,000 years, was a masterpiece of predatory engineering. Lions weren't killers by choice. They were inevitabilities. Below, life unfolded in careless grace. A procession of giraffes moved across the acacia grove, their elongated necks sweeping arcs against the pale sky. Each was an evolutionary paradox, vulnerable to predators, yet towering at 6 meters. An advantage in a world where height meant access to food others could not reach. A calf lagged behind, legs splayed awkwardly as it stretched for a low branch. Its ossicones bobbed as it strained upward, eyes wide with the innocent desperation of youth. One loose leaf dangled just beyond reach, a green miracle against the brittle dryness of the season. Farther south, chaos churned the surface of a watering hole. 2 male hippopotamuses, each weighing more than 3,000 kilograms, erupted from the depths in an explosion of foam and fury. Their cavernous jaws, lined with tusks as long as machetes, snapped with bone-crushing force, generating impacts measured at over 1,800 pounds per square inch. The combat was not random, it was ritualized, a dominance contest, encoded by hormones and neural pathways that had served their kind since the Miocene. One male lunged forward, jaws agape, his vocal sac bellowing a subsonic roar that vibrated through the water. The sound, a low-frequency pulse, traveled for kilometers, a biochemical broadcast of rage and territoriality. Across the plains, a herd of Thompson's gazelles flickered like mirages in the tall grass. They moved in tight synchrony, a collective organism responding to invisible cues of danger. Their behavior wasn't mere instinct, it was emergent complexity, a decentralized intelligence honed by predation pressure over epochs. Each leap, each turn, was governed by simple rules, yet produced patterns so intricate they rivaled the most sophisticated simulations of chaos theory. Beyond them, the elephants came, giants among giants, Their gray silhouettes rose like living megaliths from the sea of grass. A matriarch led the column, her trunk curling and uncurling with hydraulic precision as she sampled the air for volatile organic compounds, chemical whispers of water, food, and threat. Behind her, calves ambled between the towering legs of their guardians, protected not by walls or weapons, but by the sheer weight of evolutionary success. For now it was a scene of splendor, a postcard for tourists, a data set for ecologists. But under the heat-shimmering stillness, tension coiled like a spring. Every organism was a node in an intricate system, a network running on the oldest operating code on Earth. Adapt or die. Out here, time did not move forward. It circled endlessly, like the shadows of the buzzards tracing slow spirals across the sunlit ground. And something was watching from beyond the tree line. The Land Cruiser rumbled across the baked earth, its tires crunching over a mosaic of cracked soil and scattered stones. The vehicle had been stripped for utility, reinforced suspension, high-torque engine, custom cage welded into the frame. Out here, form followed function. Everything did. Inside, the air was thick and metallic, tasting faintly of dust and ozone from the heat. Bomani Akachi gripped the steering wheel loosely, guiding the machine with the practiced ease of a man who knew every undulation of this landscape, every subtle shift in wind that could carry the scent of predators or rain. His shirt clung to him in damp patches, the sweat pooling at the base of his spine. The sun outside was merciless, a radiant star pouring down 1,000 watts per square meter of energy onto the endless plains, a force as unyielding as gravity, as relentless as time. He reached up and wiped his brow with the back of his hand, squinting against the glare off the hood. The gesture was casual, unthinking, but it spoke of years spent beneath these skies, a child of the savannah, where the seasons dictated everything, when the grasses grew, when the rivers swelled, when life surged forward, and when it recoiled. Out here, the line between survival and extinction wasn't philosophical. It was ecological. If the rain didn't come, zebras starved, lions weakened, hyenas prowled closer to the villages. Life and death weren't opposites. They were partners in an endless transaction, the currency paid in flesh and bone. He cast a glance at the tourists seated behind him, pale, wide-eyed, clutching cameras with the white-knuckled grip of those unused to unpredictability. They had come chasing a fantasy, an Africa filtered through travel brochures, golden sunsets, endless herds, the romance of the wild. Bomani knew better. Africa wasn't a postcard. It was mathematics, predator-prey ratios, kilocalories in a carcass, the vector pathways of tsetse flies and ticks. Everything had a number, a pattern, a rule, and if you ignored those rules, you died. Bomani moved like water, his body flowing with the vibrations of the vehicle, his balance unbroken even when the tires jolted over unseen ruts. He had the presence of someone shaped by this land, not as a visitor, but as a native organism adapted to its harsh parameters. His skin was the deep, rich brown of the fertile earth after a heavy rain, a pigment perfected by evolutionary necessity to filter ultraviolet radiation and retain hydration in a climate that stripped moisture from bone. His face was rugged and symmetrical, sculpted by generations of selective pressures, a design optimized for survival, yet softened by a smile that came easily, a wide, reassuring curve that exposed strong white teeth. That smile was part of the service. Western tourists didn't pay thousands of dollars for authenticity. They paid for the illusion of safety, and Bomani provided both. In the rear seats, the tourists murmured nervously, shifting under the weight of the heat. A woman in a broad straw hat fanned herself with a folded park map, her pale skin flushed crimson where sunscreen had failed. Beside her, a man, husband, probably, squinted through polarized lenses, his DSLR camera resting on his lap like a weapon waiting for its quarry. 2 children sat wedged between them, the girl clutching a stuffed giraffe, the boy chewing the end of a hydration straw like it might yield answers. "Is it always this hot?" the man asked finally, his voice taut with the dry humor of discomfort. Bomani glanced in the rearview mirror, one eyebrow arched in quiet amusement. The man's face was flushed, his shirt clinging in dark patches where sweat had soaked through. "Yes," Bomani said. His tone was calm, unhurried. "The sun is democratic." He let the word linger, then continued, his voice carrying the soft timbre of southern Africa, a cadence that made even correction sound like courtesy. "It shares its power equally with everything out here. You, me, the lions. No one escapes." The man chuckled weakly, tugging at his damp collar. "Feels personal." Bomani allowed a faint smile. "It's not," he said. "It's physics. Solar irradiance on this latitude is about a kilowatt per square meter. That's what's hitting your skin right now. Raw energy, same as what drives photosynthesis in the grass, same as what fuels the muscles of a cheetah when it runs. This heat isn't an accident. It's the engine of the whole system." He let that settle as the vehicle rattled over a corrugated track. The plains shimmered ahead, a wavering sea of golden grasslands, broken only by the distant silhouettes of acacias, their crowns etched like ink strokes against the white sky. In the back seat, the man shifted again, the humor gone from his eyes now, replaced by something quieter. Respect, maybe, or the first glimmer of unease. Because out here, Bomani thought, comfort was a luxury, and the sun didn't negotiate. "The temperature is 38 degrees Celsius, Bomani continued matter-of-factly. "Relative humidity, about 15%. That means your body loses water faster than you can drink it. So sip, don't gulp." He tapped the stainless bottle wedged in the console. "Dehydration sneaks up on people out here. First comes the headache, then confusion, and confusion—" He let the thought trail off, replaced by a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The woman cleared her throat. "And the animals? They don't mind the heat?" Bomani's smile widened, but his tone remained clinical. "They evolved here. Every species you see, from the impala to the elephant, has strategies to maintain homeostasis. Elephants, for example, increase ear-flapping frequency to radiate heat through vascularized skin. Gazelles rely on counter-current heat exchange in their nasal passages, cooling arterial blood before it reaches the brain. But tourists—" He shrugged, palms up, a gesture of inevitability. He let that sink in, then shifted gears as the Land Cruiser crested a low rise. The plain unfolded ahead of them, an endless tessellation of ochre grass and scattered jackalberries, each tree an island of shade in an ocean of light. In the far distance, dark shapes moved against the horizon, a column of elephants, perhaps, or something else. Bomani's eyes flicked to them, narrowing slightly. He said nothing. Instead, he slowed the vehicle and shifted it into neutral, letting the cicadas fill the silence with their electric hum. Heat shimmered off the hood in wavering bands. For a moment, the world seemed perfectly still. But stillness out here was never peace. It was pressure. The pause before something broke. The radio crackled with static as the voice came through, warm and steady despite the distortion. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" His voice carried the weight of experience, rolling like distant thunder across the dry savannah. The tone was easy, practiced, part reassurance, part ritual. Bomani adjusted his grip on the CB radio, feeling the smooth, sun-warmed plastic beneath his fingers. The static whispered softly, a low, monotonous hiss, like distant waves, before settling back into silence. He smiled faintly, a quick flash of teeth that vanished as his gaze drifted back to the horizon. From this vantage point, the African plains seemed endless, a geological infinity stretching to the arc of the earth. Mirage bands shimmered at the edges of sight, bending light into waves that distorted the world into liquid geometry. The horizon fractured only in fragments, the skeletal silhouettes of ancient baobabs rising like twisted pillars, their swollen trunks hoarding centuries of water, and farther still, the languid figures of giraffes, drifting across the savannah like ghosts of another epoch. The tourists were silent, for once. Their cameras clicked in rapid bursts, the sound like a chorus of insects as they tried to capture what the human eye already knew was too vast for any lens. Bomani didn't mind. Silence was good. It meant they were listening, even if they didn't realize it yet. His silver name tag caught the glare of the sun, Bomani, etched in bold utilitarian letters. The badge was unnecessary. Out here, he didn't need credentials. The land was his signature. Bomani had been born far from these manicured tourist routes in Divenye, a small town carved from the green heart of the Congo. His childhood was a litany of rivers and rainstorms, of soil rich and black as obsidian. But 15 years guiding safari tours across the South African plains had rewritten him, etched new lines into his skin, deepened his understanding of this fragile, brutal equilibrium. Out here, everything obeyed a simple equation: energy in, energy out. Survival was math, and math did not forgive mistakes. He picked up the CB again and pressed the transmit button. "Welcome to Mani Tours," he said, his voice carrying the cadence of a man who could speak about lions in the same tone others used for stock markets. "Today, you'll see some of the most magnificent creatures on Earth. Apex predators, mega herbivores, the giants and titans that define this ecosystem." He paused deliberately before adding, "But remember, this is not a zoo. There are no barriers here, no glass, no fences. Every rule you know about safety back home does not apply." A nervous chuckle rippled through the rear seats, thin, brittle, like glass under strain. The sound didn't last long. Two children fidgeted against the vinyl cushions, their legs twitching with the unspent energy of youth. One drummed his fingers along the armrest in a syncopated rhythm. The other gnawed at the edge of a plastic water bottle, as if chewing could anchor him against the oppressive vastness outside. The heat pressed against the vehicle like a sentient force, a weight that seeped into metal and bone alike. It wasn't just hot, it was molecular war. Solar radiation, pounding the savannah, drove surface temperatures past 40 degrees Celsius, accelerating evaporation to a point where sweat vanished before it could bead on skin. Hydration wasn't a comfort here. It was a survival algorithm. Lose 2% of body water, and cognitive function slipped. 4%, and heat stroke began its quiet sabotage of organ systems. The air itself seemed baked into hardness, stripped of moisture, tasting faintly metallic in the back of the throat. Every breath felt filtered through an invisible sieve of heat. Outside, the brittle hiss of wind combed through dry speargrass, releasing a sound that was less like rustle and more like static, white noise born from the friction of cellulose blades, brittle enough to snap at a touch. Bomani heard it all and catalogued it without thinking. He'd learned to read this silence, to interpret its tonal shifts like a cardiogram of the ecosystem. Today, it felt wrong, flat, hollow, lacking the intermittent punctuation of life. No sharp cries of francolins, no rhythmic clatter of oxpeckers riding on the backs of buffalo, just the wind. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The children's faces were flushed, framed by damp strands of hair plastered to their foreheads. Their parents offered weak smiles, the kind that teetered on the edge of forced optimism. Bomani saw the calculation in their eyes. Is this safe? Heat feels heavy, doesn't it? Bomani said, his voice low, conversational. It cut through the stifling hush like a blade. That's because it is. Warm air holds more water vapor and water has mass. So when you feel this, he gestured toward the shimmering horizon with an easy flick of his wrist. You're feeling weight, literal kilograms of it, pressing down from above. That's why everything moves slower out here. Animals, people, even sound. The father laughed lightly, a reflex more than a response. Sounds scientific, he said. Bomani gave a brief smile. Everything out here is science, he murmured. Every step, every breath. Energy flows, heat gradients, osmotic balances. His tone cooled, dropping almost to a whisper. And when those flows change, when something disturbs the ratios. He let the words trail off, eyes returning to the grasslands outside, the mirage-drenched expanse that suddenly felt less like an open plain and more like a sealed chamber, pressure building silently within. Something moved at the edge of vision, quick, low, then gone. Bomani's hand tightened on the steering wheel. The boy, 10, maybe 11, leaned forward. Are there lions out there? His voice cracked on the last word, teetering between fear and fascination. Bomani met his gaze in the mirror, his eyes dark pools that gave nothing away. Yes, he said simply. Then after a beat, lions are always out there. They can hear this engine from 3 kilometers away. They can smell you from 5. The only reason you don't see them, he tilted his head toward the waving grass, is because they are better at hiding than you are at looking. The boy sank back into his seat, eyes wide. His sister clutched her stuffed giraffe tighter, as if cotton and thread could shield her from reality. The woman, their mother, cleared her throat. But they won't come near the vehicle, right? I read they don't attack trucks. Bomani smiled faintly, but his tone remained clinical. They don't attack often, he said, because they are cautious. Predators avoid risk. A broken jaw means starvation, so they choose their moments very carefully. But they learn, they adapt. Out here, evolution is not a chapter in a book. It's happening every second. The man, father, mid-40s, sunburn spreading across his temples, shifted uneasily. So what do we do if something happens? Stay in the vehicle, Bomani said. His voice had gone quiet, flat. You move, you separate yourself from the group, and you become an outlier. And outliers. He glanced back, locking eyes with the man for a heartbeat. Our data points removed from the set. No one spoke after that. Bomani eased the vehicle forward, hands steady on the wheel. His eyes scanned the horizon, not lazily, but systematically, like a biologist running a field transect. Every flicker of movement carried information. A ripple of grass against the wind might be nothing, or it might be a signal, part of a pattern he'd learned to recognize the way other men read spreadsheets. To the tourists, the savannah was a painting. To Bomani, it was a system, an intricate mesh of predator-prey dynamics, heat budgets, nutrient cycles. The lions resting under the shade of an acacia were not symbols of wilderness. They were endothermic predators balancing energy equations, their metabolic rate throttled by the constraints of thermoregulation. The giraffes, browsing nearby, weren't just tall. They were vertical specialists, exploiting a feeding niche above the reach of other herbivores. Bomani knew all this. He loved all this. And yet beneath the admiration, a thin wire of tension hummed in his chest. Because lately, the system felt wrong. The Land Cruiser rolled forward with a low mechanical growl, its reinforced suspension absorbing the uneven terrain. Dust billowed behind them, curling into the sky like smoke, dissipating slowly in the dry heat. The air was heavy with the scent of sun-baked grass and distant rain, a phantom promise that would never come. Bomani gripped the steering wheel loosely, the movement unconscious. His other hand rested near the gear shift, fingers tapping a rhythm that betrayed the restlessness under his calm exterior. Something was different today. He couldn't name it yet, but he could feel it in the ambient tension of the land, the way an old tracker feels the pulse of a storm before the first clouds gather. His father had always said the same thing. Trust your bones. They know before your eyes do. Bomani's father had been a guide, too. One of the best. He'd died under an open sky not far from here, taken by a flash flood in a ravine that had been bone dry for a decade. Nature had rules, but those rules weren't for men. They were for survival. And survival didn't care about legacies. On your left, Bomani said quietly, his voice softening as though he were afraid even sound might tip the balance. The tourists turned as one, a rustle of nylon and the staccato clicks of camera shutters snapping like distant gunfire. Lenses rose in unison, cell phones held aloft, their screens glowing in the harsh African light. In the shallows of a seasonal pan, the birds moved with hypnotic precision. Mycteria ibis, tall as small children, their forms precise and symmetrical. Plumage of stark white contrasted with pinions dipped in ink black, while their bills, blades of lacquered ivory tipped with sulfur yellow, cut the light like surgical instruments. Against the mirrored surface they seemed unreal, artifacts of some biomechanical experiment, moving as if under algorithmic control, governed by a program older than human memory. Each step was deliberate, calibrated, a slow oscillation of tendon and bone as their long legs scissored through the surface tension. Ripples radiated outward in perfect concentric waves, the physics of displacement made visible. Their hunting sequence was equally mathematical. Pause, triangulate, strike. Energy minimized, yield maximized. Bomani thought of it the way a biologist might describe it, a predator-prey optimization model in real time. Mycteria ibis, he said softly. Yellow-billed storks, one of the most efficient scavengers in the savannah ecosystem. He gestured toward the shallow pan, where the bronze water trembled with heat mirages. Their beaks are designed for leverage, perfect for stripping muscle and tendon, but right now, they're fishing, opportunistic behavior. They'll eat anything they can swallow without expending more energy than they gain. His eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't looking at the birds anymore. Not really. He was watching the water. The pan was a seasonal feature, a transient node in the hydrological network, here now, gone in weeks. Under normal conditions, its biomass curve should have been predictable. Insects, amphibians, the occasional fish trapped when the rains retreated. But something was wrong. The water was too still, the insects too few. No flicker of minnows beneath the surface, no flash of amphibian eyes breaking tension. Just absence. Bomani's tone didn't change. Not yet. "Do you know what makes this place work?" he asked, still watching the pan, scanning for anomalies. One of the men, a heavy-set tourist with a camera the size of a rifle, shrugged. "Lions?" Bomani almost smiled. "Energy flow," he said evenly, his voice pitched low, the cadence deliberate, like a professor guiding a thought experiment. "From sunlight to grass, from grass to grazers, from grazers to predators, that's the equation." He paused, letting the words settle like silt. Disturb one variable and everything changes. His eyes swept the bank again, tracing the cracked mosaic of mud for prints, for patterns. Nothing obvious, not yet. But something about the stillness gnawed at him. "They're specialists," he continued, gesturing toward the storks. "Watch their movements. Looks random, doesn't it? But it's not. It's stochastic foraging, statistically optimized to maximize prey detection." He leaned slightly forward, his gaze fixed on the shallow pan, where the birds moved with the eerie precision of a programmed machine. "They're hunting catfish now. Feel how they probe the water? Those bills close in about 30 milliseconds. That's faster than you can blink." A murmur rippled through the back seats, the soft, reverent tones of polite astonishment, the kind of wonder that came from seeing nature as performance, not as a network of constraints and feedback loops. Bomani let them have their illusion, but the tightness in his chest remained. The savannah's laws were simple, elegant, and merciless. They didn't break without reason. A stork froze suddenly, head cocked, bill poised like a sprung trap, then a strike. A blur of motion so fast it seemed to dislocate from time. The bird lunged, its beak flashing like a guillotine through the bronze surface of the water. For a moment, Bomani expected the familiar, the glitter of scales, the reflexive thrash of dying prey. But when the stork lifted its head, there was nothing. No fish writhing between the mandibles. Just water streaming off polished keratin, falling in droplets that fractured the sunlight into hard shards of glass. The bird stood motionless for an instant, as if recalculating. Then it struck again and again. Each time, nothing. Bomani felt the first thread of unease coil in his gut, winding tight. Something had broken the equation. The Land Cruiser jolted forward, tires grinding against fractured basalt as they crested a low ridge. A gust of wind swept across the grassland, bending the tall speargrass into rippling waves. Bomani tasted dust on his tongue and something else, an absence, a silence too deep. "Stop the vehicle," whispered a voice behind him, urgent, breathless. Bomani flicked his eyes to the rear view. The mother, wide-brimmed sun hat, tilted at a precarious angle, sunscreen streaked across her cheeks like war paint, was pointing with a trembling hand. "What is that?" Bomani followed her gaze and froze. Sliding out of the dense thicket like something conjured from myth was a bongo. Its coat gleamed in the slanting light, a deep burnished crimson overlaid with razor-thin white stripes, each line drawn with a precision that looked almost artificial. The horns swept back in perfect spirals, polished black like obsidian, glinting where sunlight touched them. For a heartbeat, Bomani simply stared, his breath caught despite himself. "They call them the ghosts of the forest," he murmured, his voice dropping into a register the tourists had never heard before. "You hardly ever see one in the open." The tone carried something unexpected. Reverence, yes, but braided with it a thread of warning. With a flick of his wrist, he killed the engine. The diesel choked into silence, leaving behind a stillness so immense it pressed in like deep water. Heat shimmered above the hood, turning the air into molten glass. Somewhere far off, a cicada droned its relentless electric hum. The tourists erupted into chaos, a storm of mechanical whirs and digital chimes, lenses telescoping outward, shutters firing in frantic bursts. "Oh my God, this is incredible," an older man said, his voice quivering with awe that struck Bomani as almost indecent. The camera in his hands chattered in rapid bursts, spitting out digital approximations of what the eye could never truly hold. They had no idea what they were looking at. To them, it was a miracle of nature, a prize for their patience, a story to export back home in filtered squares and captions. But Bomani knew better. This wasn't luck. It wasn't even chance. It was an anomaly. Bongos didn't behave like this. Not here. Not now. They were phantoms of the undergrowth, masters of concealment evolved across millennia for a single purpose: to remain unseen. Their existence depended on invisibility, and yet this one had emerged into open ground, bathed in raw sunlight, its flanks slick with sweat that gleamed like varnish. That wasn't boldness. That was desperation. Bomani watched the tremor in its skin, the way its ears cut the air in sharp staccato arcs. This was a prey animal, broadcasting at full volume on a frequency the tourists couldn't hear. "Something is wrong. Something is hunting me." His fingers flexed against the steering wheel. Out here, behaviors weren't random. They were variables. And variables, when they shifted without cause, meant the system was changing. And when the system changed, nothing stayed safe. The antelope stood framed by the thicket, poised as if carved from living mahogany. Its ears flicked in rapid arcs, rotating like radar dishes, triangulating invisible signals in the air. Its nostrils flared, tasting currents Bomani could not. Under that sleek hide, every muscle fiber vibrated with isometric tension, a body coiled, primed, running diagnostics on its environment. It wasn't grazing, it wasn't calm. This was an animal listening for death. Bomani knew prey species the way a mathematician knows ratios. He could read them as easily as he read spoor in the dust. And right now, every cue, ear rotation speed, neck elevation, tail flick frequency, broadcast the same message in a code few people could decipher: panic. The bongo jerked its head toward the tree line. Its pupils dilated into black coins, swallowing the light. Bomani's jaw locked. Then the antelope detonated into motion. No warning, no gradual escalation, just explosive force. A blur of crimson muscle tearing across the pan and vanishing into green shadow. The departure was so fluid, it seemed less like running and more like subtraction, as if the forest had simply reclaimed what was briefly borrowed. All that remained was a rustle of leaves and a thin ochre plume curling in the stagnant air. And for the first time, Bomani let his eyes drift past the place where the bongo had stood, into the dark margin of the tree line. His pulse thudded once, heavy as a drum beat, because nothing had moved there, nothing at all, and that was wrong. He turned the key, and the Land Cruiser shuddered awake, the diesel engine coughing once before settling into a low mechanical growl. The vibration traveled through the chassis, up the steering column, into his bones, a visceral reminder of the thin membrane separating human intent from the raw physics of steel and torque. In the rearview mirror, he saw their faces lit with triumph, the mother flushed with excitement, the children grinning like lottery winners, the father scrolling through his camera roll with a gambler's fever, tallying digital trophies. They didn't see it. They never saw it. "All right," Bomani said finally, his voice smooth again, scrubbed of what he felt inside. Professional tone, neutral cadence. "We move on." He shifted into gear and eased forward, tires crunching over grit. But his eyes weren't on the road. They were sweeping the perimeter, oscillating in tight arcs like a radar sweep, parsing terrain in fragments, scanning for anomalies. "Next stop is the watering hole," he continued, keeping his tone conversational, calibrated to reassure. "If luck's with us, we might see some Nile hippopotamus, big animals, over 3,000 kilos of muscle and bone." He slowed slightly, adjusting for a rut in the track. "They spend 90% of the day submerged. Same reason we wear hats and sunscreen. Just like us, they can burn. Nature doesn't play favorites." A nervous chuckle bubbled up from the back. "Guess sunscreen doesn't cut it for them, huh?" Bomani didn't answer. He couldn't. Not now. He was listening. Listening to the data points the land whispered to those who knew the code. The birds gone silent, the stillness in the air, viscous and heavy, the phantom of a bongo detonating into the thicket like a flare launched into an empty sky. Silence wasn't absence. Silence was signal. And the equation, the one written in energy flows, predator-prey dynamics, behavioral heuristics, it wasn't balancing anymore. The constants had shifted. The math didn't add up. He kept driving, his jaw locked, the hum of the engine masking a truth that crawled cold in his gut. Something out there had rewritten the system. As the Land Cruiser rolled toward the watering hole, Bomani tightened his grip on the wheel, feeling the old instinct coiled tighter inside him, a primitive signal nested deep in his brainstem, older than language, older than fire. It was the instinct of prey that has scented the wrong wind, the reflex of an organism that knows, without knowing how, that the environment has shifted against it. The track ahead shimmered in the glare, a wavering filament of dust braided with light. Heat danced across the horizon like molten glass, bending the world into liquid geometry. To the tourists, it was a scene from a nature documentary playing out in perfect sunlit symmetry. To Bomani, it was a data set, and the numbers weren't right. He exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, while his eyes kept sweeping the margins of the savannah, the ragged tree lines, the grass rippling in bronze waves. To someone untrained, it was still beauty. To Bomani, it was silence, coded in plain sight. Behind him, the tourists were buzzing, oblivious, speculating about hippos, laughing at their own jokes, trading cameras like gamblers swapping chips in a game they didn't understand. The sound irritated him, not for what it was, but for what it wasn't. It wasn't calibrated to the frequency of this land. Out here, noise was an intrusion. He thought of the bongo again, the way it stood in the open, every muscle tuned to panic, before detonating into the bush like a fugitive fleeing a crime scene. Prey animals didn't break protocol without cause. They lived and died by risk assessment. And this one had read the landscape and seen something Bomani hadn't. He flexed his fingers against the wheel, knuckles whitening. His ears strained for the subtle harmonics of danger, the kind that didn't announce themselves with roars or gunshots, but whispered through absence. A sudden eruption of motion broke the monotony of the plains. A flock of red-billed qualeus launched skyward in a synchronized wave, their wings beating like a single organism, their shrill alarm calls tearing through the stagnant heat. The sound was sharp, piercing, an ecological alarm bell. Bomani's eyes flicked toward the disturbance, and for a fraction of a second, his muscles tightened. "Whoa! Look at that!" one of the tourists exclaimed, fumbling for his camera. A burst of shutter clicks followed, staccato and oblivious. Bomani said nothing. He kept his eyes pinned to the horizon, to the black smudge boiling upward against the molten blue sky. Birds, dozens, no hundreds. A column of wings spiraling in chaotic ascent, their bodies flashing like shards of obsidian in the harsh African light. To the tourists, it was a spectacle, a screensaver come alive. But Bomani wasn't looking for beauty. He was reading a pattern. Flocks didn't behave like that without cause. Not in this system. Explosions of flight were energy expensive, metabolically punishing. Birds spent most of their lives calculating margins, calories in, calories out, survival balanced on a ledger as thin as a blade. They didn't launch skyward in blind panic unless something rewrote the math. And Bomani had spent a lifetime decoding those shifts, those fractures in the quiet architecture of the wild. This wasn't random. This was signal. Ahead, the track dipped into a shallow basin where the watering hole lay. He could already see the mirage of it, a fractured mirror embedded in ochre earth, bordered by a corona of dark mud. But there was something else, something that made his pulse climb one notch. From this distance, the water looked wrong, not in color, not in movement, in pattern. There were no concentric rings from frogs surfacing, no scattered bursts of insects strafing the surface tension, no cattle egrets lifting and resettling in jittery arcs. The place looked inert. The Land Cruiser lurched as its tires sank into a patch of viscous black mud, the suspension groaning. There was a wet, sucking sound, followed by a sharp slap, as arcs of clay-thick earth sprayed up against the undercarriage. Bomani eased off the accelerator, keeping the momentum steady, eyes flicking between the mud and the horizon. He didn't like surprises out here. The last time he'd been surprised, a bull elephant had nearly flipped his vehicle like a tin toy. The heat was oppressive, the kind that turned steel into a branding iron and made the air shimmer in liquid waves. It pressed against skin, crawled into lungs, slowed the pulse of thought. At 38 degrees Celsius, Bomani calculated, human bodies began to degrade operational efficiency. Cognitive drift, electrolyte imbalance, early dehydration cues masked as fatigue. Tourists rarely noticed until they tipped into heat stress, and by then, the damage curve was exponential. "Man," the father in the back said, dragging the word like sand. Sweat beaded on his temples, running into the grooves of sunburnt skin. "You ever get used to this heat?" Bomani glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You adapt," he said evenly. "Perspiration, vasodilation. Your body's doing it now, but adaptation is not immunity." The man gave a weak laugh. "That sounds reassuring." "It should," Bomani said. "You'd already be unconscious if you weren't sweating." That shut him up. Bomani faced forward again, hands loose on the wheel, posture fluid. He drew in a slow breath through his nose. The air smelled of scorched grass and something else, something faint, metallic, riding under the surface like a hidden current. Ahead, the savannah stretched in every direction, vast and silent under the punishing sun. Acacia trees punctuated the landscape, their flat crowns like green parasols frozen in time. They stood as they had for millions of years, through the rise and fall of species, through Pleistocene droughts and Holocene floods, guardians of an ecosystem older than the idea of history. Bomani always felt small in their presence, not diminished exactly, just reminded. Out here, humanity was an afterthought, a late arrival to an ancient equation. The boy in the middle row broke the silence. "What's out there?" he asked, pointing at the horizon. "Life," Bomani said softly. Then after a beat, "And death. Always both." The mother tried to laugh, but it came out thin. "That's poetic." "It's statistical," Bomani corrected. "Every organism out here is a variable in a system driven by energy transfer. Predators convert biomass into motion, prey into escape velocity. Death is not an event. It's a redistribution of resources." The father gave a dry chuckle. "Sounds like something out of National Geographic." "No," Bomani said, his voice calm, almost clinical. "National Geographic edits the blood out." The words landed heavier than he intended, but he didn't take them back. Because it was true. And because today, something in the air made him feel like blood wasn't far off. He tightened his grip on the wheel and pressed the throttle lightly. The Land Cruiser powered through the last of the mud with a sucking roar, climbing onto firmer ground. Ahead, the grass rolled away in waves of ochre and gold, broken by the jagged silhouette of a distant watering hole. A thin vapor rose above it, bending light into mirages that danced at the edge of sight. That was where he was headed, and that was where answers waited, because birds didn't panic for no reason. And Bomani trusted his bones. Bomani's thoughts drifted as the Land Cruiser hummed forward, its tires rolling over baked earth that cracked like shattered porcelain under the relentless sun. This place was paradise, but not the kind of paradise in magazines. It was a world stripped to its essential code: heat, hunger, survival. The Serengeti stretched beyond sight, a living mosaic of ochre grasslands and thorn-studded acacias, its patterns older than humanity itself. Out here, Bomani felt small, not insignificant, but humbled, like a late entry into an equation that had been balanced long before his species appeared. He inhaled slowly, tasting dust and something metallic in the air, and glanced toward the river ahead. A shimmer of reflected light under a sky so hard and blue, it looked carved from glass. The waterline was a narrow band, flanked by mats of reeds and dark pools where shadows lingered like secrets. "Keep your eyes on the river," he said suddenly, breaking his own reverie. His tone was calm, almost conversational, but the authority beneath it was unmistakable. "You never know when one will surface. Hippos can hold their breath for 6, sometimes 7 minutes. Long enough for you to forget they're there, and then—" He snapped his fingers. The sound cracked through the hushed cabin like a gunshot. Several heads jerked up. "Just like that," Bomani said, his voice smooth again, but the edge was still there. "They appear, and when they do, you don't have time to think. A full-grown bull weighs over 3,000 kilos. That's the mass of a compact car, but with muscle density 3 times higher and a bite force of 1,800 psi. In water, they can accelerate to 30 kilometers an hour. On land, his gaze flicked briefly to the tourists, his eyes unreadable. They can outrun you if they want to. Silence settled over the cabin, heavy and brittle. A child whispered, "Faster than a person?" "Faster than a sprinter," Bomani said. "And here's the thing you probably don't know. Despite what you've read in glossy magazines, hippos kill more people in Africa than lions, leopards, or crocodiles combined." The words hung in the air, and for the first time since the drive began, the chatter in the back seats died completely. All that remained was the low growl of the engine and, beyond the open windows, the river glinting like molten metal under a merciless sun. Bomani kept his eyes on that water, watching the shimmer, waiting for the equation to balance or break entirely. A low whistle came from the back. Joseph, the stocky one in a sweat-stained polo, gave a dry laugh that didn't quite mask his unease. "Jesus," he muttered, peeling back the wrapper of a melted candy bar. The chocolate had liquefied into a distorted slab, glossy and black like volcanic glass. He bit into it anyway, grimacing as it collapsed in his fingers. Bomani didn't smile. His eyes stayed fixed on the river as they approached, his peripheral vision sweeping the reeds for any ripple, any fragment of motion that didn't belong. "The teeth," he added quietly, as though to himself. 50-centimeter canines, enough bite force to snap a femur clean through. That's structural failure in less than half a second. The vehicle went silent except for the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thud of tires on uneven earth. A willowy woman in a linen shirt, now damp with sweat, cleared her throat. "They're herbivores, though, right? They eat plants." "Yes," Bomani said without looking back. "Mostly. That doesn't make them safe. Diet is irrelevant to aggression. Territoriality, dominance displays, mating pressure. Those are the drivers. Hippos kill not because they're hungry. They kill because you are in the wrong place at the wrong time." The woman's lips tightened. She folded the map in her lap like a shield. "Sounds like my ex-wife," Joseph muttered. No one laughed. The cruiser rolled over a low rise, and the river spread out below them like a strip of molten silver, broken by glints of sunlight and drifting mats of vegetation. Heat shimmered above the surface in rippling bands, bending the air into distortions that made distance hard to judge. Bomani slowed the vehicle, engine rumbling down to a low growl. The smell hit them first, a cocktail of mud, decaying vegetation, and the sharp ammonia tang of animal waste, a sign of life, a sign of mass. He shifted into neutral and let the engine idle. Silence collapsed over the group like a lid. Outside, cicadas droned with the steady hum of high-voltage wires. A single bird called from somewhere unseen, then went quiet. Bomani scanned the water. His eyes moved in measured arcs, cataloging shapes, searching for disruptions. The geometry of a nostril breaking the surface, the faint concentric ripples of displaced water. Hippos were experts in misdirection, bodies concealed under the opaque mirror of the river, just two eyes and two slits breaking the surface tension. But there was nothing. No nostrils, no ripples, only stillness. And Bomani didn't like stillness. Because in this system, an ecosystem optimized over millions of years, stillness wasn't equilibrium. Stillness was pressure waiting to break. The tourist's anticipation hung in the cabin like static, thick and humming. Bomani could feel it without looking. Forward-leaning bodies, breath held just a little too long, the rhythmic clicks of cameras adjusting aperture settings in nervous expectation. He knew how to pace the reveal. It was part of the job, managing the psychology of awe, keeping their wonder on a steady drip feed. And then they saw them, dark, hulking forms, half submerged in the water like the armored turrets of some prehistoric fleet, motionless, almost inert, except for the slow flick of an ear, the lazy roll of an eye, the ripple of water as a massive body shifted beneath the opaque surface. The hippos floated in deceptive peace, their curved backs slick with algae blooms and streaks of drying mud. The children gasped in unison. Cameras snapped like distant artillery. One of the kids, a boy with freckles and a Yankees cap, leaned dangerously over the doorframe, eyes wide as moons. "They're huge," he whispered. Bomani allowed himself the smallest grin. They always loved the hippos. Tourists came for the lions, but stayed for these river beasts. Something about the contradiction, a face almost comical, paired with a lethality that defied intuition. As if on cue, one of the massive bulls exhaled explosively, a snort that sent a fountain of spray arcing into the light. A grunt followed, a deep subsonic rumble that vibrated through the metal frame of the vehicle and into Bomani's bones. The sound wasn't random, it was coded, a low-frequency broadcast that could travel kilometers underwater, signaling dominance, threat, intent. "Listen," Bomani said softly. "That's not noise, that's data. Those grunts carry information, identity markers, reproductive status, aggression thresholds. Hippos live in what we call a fission-fusion society, loose hierarchies, multiple bulls competing for dominance. When you hear that sound, it's telling every animal in range where it stands in the equation." The girl, clutching her stuffed giraffe, whispered, "They look so still." "Stillness," Bomani said, voice dropping almost to a murmur, "isn't peace. It's potential energy." The land cruiser jolted violently as it crested a rise, the suspension groaning in protest before settling into the rhythmic bounce of uneven ground. Dust plumed behind them, curling in ochre ribbons before dissolving into the shimmering heat. Ahead, the plains fractured into an island of giants, a grove of baobab trees rising from the savannah like colossal statues, their swollen trunks twisting against the sky. The sight was disorienting, almost alien. These were not trees, as most understood the term. They were outliers, anomalies, plants that had abandoned elegance for survival, evolving swollen water-storing trunks that could sustain them through decades of drought. Their bark, smooth and gray, reflected sunlight like polished stone, while their sparse crowns clawed upward with skeletal branches, reaching for a sky that offered no mercy. Bomani eased off the throttle and let the cruiser roll forward in low gear, the engine humming like a distant insect. He raised one hand from the wheel and gestured toward the grove, his voice calm and deliberate, the tone of a man who understood the weight of what he was saying. "Baobabs," he said, "Adansonia digitata. They can live for more than 2,000 years. Some are older than the pyramids. These trees have survived climate shifts, empires, extinctions, perfectly adapted to a system that punishes weakness." He paused, letting the idea sink in, then continued. "During drought, they draw on water stored in their trunks, sometimes tens of thousands of liters. Their bark doesn't burn easily. Even when lightning strikes, they regenerate. In ecology, we call them keystone species. They provide food, shelter, water for dozens of organisms. Take them out of the equation, and the system collapses." The words hung in the air, mingling with the hiss of hot wind. The tourists stared in silence, heads craning to follow the colossal trunks as they passed beneath the cruiser's open roof. Jamal, a lanky young man in mirrored sunglasses, leaned toward the woman beside him. His voice carried a note of wonder, though he tried to mask it with casualness. "Imagine what those trees have seen," he said, gesturing toward the gnarled giants as if they were witnesses to some forgotten epoch. Courtney shifted, resting her head lightly on his shoulder. Her voice was soft, but Bomani heard it clearly over the low growl of the engine. "I'd give anything to know," she murmured. Bomani allowed himself the smallest smile. He had grown up with these trees, played in their shadows, listened to the stories his father told about them under moonlit skies. But even now, after years of guiding foreigners across this land, the baobabs unnerved him. They were more than plants. They were archives, living repositories of environmental memory. In their concentric rings, in their isotopic signatures, lay a record of centuries, rainfall patterns, temperature shifts, the invisible hand of climate sculpting the fate of species. He thought briefly of the research stations, of scientists drilling cores from these ancient trunks, mapping the isotopic ratios of carbon and oxygen to reconstruct histories that predated written language. In their data lay warnings, patterns repeating like fractals, drought cycles tightening, intervals shrinking, a system under stress. 2,000 years, Jamal said again, shaking his head. "That's insane." "Not insane," Bomani corrected softly. "Efficient. Evolution rewards efficiency. If you're standing here after 2 millennia, it's because every variable in your design optimized for survival. Everything else failed." Courtney tilted her head, curious now. "So, you think these trees will outlast us?" Bomani didn't answer right away. His eyes were on the horizon, scanning the margins where the grove fractured into grassland, where shadows pooled like ink. "They've already outlasted entire civilizations," he said finally. "Ask yourself, what makes us different?" The question lingered, heavier than the heat. Courtney opened her mouth to respond, then closed it, her fingers tightening slightly on Jamal's arm. The cruiser bumped over another rut, and a loose panel rattled in the doorframe. Ahead, the baobabs loomed larger, their contorted silhouettes casting elongated shadows that crawled across the ochre earth like living things. Between the trunks, Bomani glimpsed something. Just a flicker, a shape where no shape should be. He blinked, recalibrated, probably nothing. A trick of the light, heat bending the air into illusions. But the unease stayed, coiled in his gut like a latent fault line, because the system was precise, predictable, and lately Bomani had been seeing patterns that didn't fit the model. He gripped the wheel a little tighter, muscles flexing in his forearms. "All right," he said, voice dropping to a register that stilled the chatter in the back seats. "Stay inside the vehicle. Keep your hands in. From here on out, no exceptions." The Land Cruiser eased into a lower gear, its tires crunching over gravel as they approached the base of a granite kopje, a rugged outcrop thrusting up from the plains like the vertebrae of some buried titan. The heat shimmered across its surface in molten waves, and the rock radiated stored solar energy like a thermal battery. Bomani's hands rested loosely on the wheel, but his eyes were everywhere, scanning in precise arcs. Each flicker of motion was a variable, each shadow an equation waiting to be solved. And then he saw it, a flick of movement, a curve of tawny muscle against gray stone. Bomani's pulse ticked up, just a fraction, as the pattern resolved in his mind. A lioness, sprawled along the warm granite. Her body stretched like liquid gold, perfectly aligned with the fractured geometry of the rock. From this angle she was almost invisible, a mirage of fur and sunlight, until she moved, a single twitch of her tail against the stone. He felt the corner of his mouth lift. The tourists hadn't seen her yet. They were busy photographing the kopje, oblivious to the predator woven into its shape. "Look to your right," Bomani said quietly, his voice slicing through the hum of the engine, commanding, but low enough to feel intimate. "Up there, on the rocks, you're about to meet one of nature's greatest hunters." Cameras swung as if on hinges. Gasps punctuated the air like soft detonations. "Oh my God," someone whispered. The lioness raised her head slowly, like an ancient queen acknowledging her audience. Then, with a languid precision that belied the raw violence coded in her DNA, she opened her jaws in a yawn. The tourists laughed nervously at the domestic familiarity of the gesture, until they saw the teeth. Bomani watched their faces shift as the reality registered. Those weren't the teeth of a sleepy house cat. Those were weapons, evolved over 2 million years for a single purpose: to kill with economy. The canines, 7 centimeters of ivory honed to puncture carotid arteries, gleamed in the hard light, paired with a bite force exceeding 650 psi, enough to snap cervical vertebrae in milliseconds. "She's beautiful," Courtney whispered. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Her throat was tight, as if the air itself resisted leaving her lungs. She couldn't look away. The lioness crouched low on the rock, eyes locked to hers, amber irises rimmed with darker gold, the pupils pinpoints. There was no curiosity in that gaze, only calculation. Bomani remained perfectly still, his posture erect, almost military. His breathing was steady. Where Courtney felt awe and a creeping terror, Bomani's mind ticked through figures, ratios, and probabilities, as if the lioness were physics embodied, kinetic energy waiting to be released, momentum and torque wrapped in flesh and bone. "Yes," he said finally, voice measured, clinical, beautiful, and lethal. He raised a hand, slowly, pointing to the massive curve of the animal's shoulder. 120 kilograms, give or take. Nearly 60% of that is pure contractile tissue, fast twitch fibers, tuned for explosive power. In the first 3 seconds of a charge, she'll reach 70 kilometers an hour. That acceleration is faster than most prey can even register, faster than our nervous systems can signal the muscles to flee. Courtney's brow furrowed. 70 in 3 seconds. He nodded. Think of a Formula One car, stripped down to raw instinct. Cheetahs can match that velocity, but their efficiency collapses within a few hundred meters. They overheat. They burn out. This lioness is different. Her stride efficiency is higher. Limb-to-torso ratio optimized for mechanical advantage, chest cavity expanded for greater lung volume. That tail? It's a gyroscopic stabilizer, a counterbalance at high velocity. Watch how it flicks with every subtle movement. Nature's rudder. The lioness shifted, muscles rippling beneath tawny hide. It was like watching steel cables flex beneath velvet. Her shoulder blades rose and fell with each breath, mechanical in their precision. Courtney caught herself leaning back, as though distance alone might shield her. "She was designed for this," Bomani murmured. His tone carried a trace of reverence, quickly reined back into clinical detachment. "Blood chemistry supports it. Hemoglobin density is extraordinary, far higher than ours. Each red cell carries more oxygen per unit volume, which means she can sustain anaerobic output longer. Her heart can spike to 250 beats per minute without arrhythmia, without muscle ischemia. No mammal in the wild maintains that balance so perfectly. Courtney tore her eyes away just long enough to glance at him. Designed? Bomani's lips curved, almost a smile. That's what you see when you look at her. A design. An apex predator engineered over 2 million years of selective pressure. Every tendon, every muscle, every sensory organ built to solve one problem: catch and kill. The lioness exhaled, a low rumble in her chest, and the sound rolled across the savannah like a warning. Courtney felt it resonate in her ribs. Bomani's eyes narrowed, still fixed on the lioness. His voice dropped, quiet but firm. Don't mistake beauty for mercy. She is evolution's perfected machine. And right now, all her calculations are about us. Nick O'Donnell, a younger man in his late 20s, adjusted the horn-rimmed glasses that perpetually slid down his nose. He leaned forward in his seat, his camera's telephoto lens drawn tight to his face, like the scope of a rifle. Through the viewfinder, the savannah fractured at the edges, faint halos of color bleeding where glass and light failed to align, making the lioness appear to flicker in and out of reality. He tracked her with a steady grip, finger poised over the shutter. Each breath fogged faintly against the glass before the hot wind stripped it away. The lens magnified every detail: the twitch of a whisker, the minute contraction of muscle beneath golden hide, the deliberate stillness of a predator who knew she owned the terrain. "Wow," he whispered, the word escaping before he could stop it. It wasn't reverence so much as disbelief. His voice was barely audible over the low, steady hum of the idling land cruiser's engine. He tightened focus, framing the lioness's eyes, and felt his pulse quicken. The magnification made them look enormous, predatory. 2 discs of molten amber ringed in shadow. He felt, absurdly, as though the glass was not a barrier at all, but a thin membrane she could pierce at will. Behind the mechanical click of focus rings and aperture dials, Nick's mind buzzed with its own commentary. The light refracting in the heat waves, the diffraction patterns softening the edges, the strange, dreamlike physics of air superheated by the midday sun. All of it combined to make the predator in his lens look like she had stepped out of some distorted dimension. He let out a long, low whistle. It was meant to be casual, but it carried the edge of nerves. "Careful with that sound," Bomani muttered from the driver's seat without looking at him. His voice was quiet, controlled. Even a small noise carries meaning out here. Nick froze, his finger hovering above the shutter release, suddenly aware of how fragile the illusion of safety was. Through the glass, the lioness hadn't moved, but her ears, subtle, precise, had flicked once in his direction. Nick swallowed, throat dry. "Sorry," he murmured, forcing the words out, his voice cracking somewhere between awe and disbelief. His lens never strayed from the golden shape resting on the stones. She's just sitting there. To him, it was a spectacle, a frozen frame from a wildlife documentary made real, the kind of image that would loop endlessly on some late-night channel, stripped of context, reduced to majesty. Except here, there was no distance, no narrator, no safety in glass or screen. He adjusted the focus, micro-movements of his fingertips, fine-tuning the glass. The lioness's whiskers came into razor clarity. Each filament seemed individually lit, catching stray photons from the brutal African sun. He could see the slow dilation of her pupils, the minute twitch of an ear as it tracked invisible frequencies. Nick's pulse hammered in his throat. He took the shot. The shutter snapped, mechanical and final, like a trigger pull. The sound cut through the dry air, impossibly loud to his own ears. Through the lens, the lioness didn't flinch, but Nick saw it, the subtle contraction of the shoulders, the shift of muscle beneath skin. A readiness coiled there, quiet but absolute. Predators could wait hours, even days, for the right moment to expend energy. Every motion was calculated, every ounce of muscle measured against the probability of a kill. He exhaled slowly, hands damp on the camera body. Another frame, another click. Each one felt like a trespass. "That's the illusion," Bomani replied, eyes never leaving the lioness. "Predators don't waste energy. Out here, energy is currency. Every kill is a cost-benefit analysis. Miss too many times, and you starve." As if to punctuate the point, the lioness shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, her muscles flowing beneath her hide like coiled hydraulics, her eyes, amber, unblinking, fixed on something beyond the cruiser downwind. Bomani followed her gaze and saw the ripple of grass, the faint movement of a small herd of impala grazing near the edge of the kopje. The tourists began whispering excitedly, the staccato clatter of camera shutters breaking the silence. Bomani resisted the urge to tell them to stop. Sound mattered. Behavior mattered. They were variables in a system too few understood. "Is she gonna hunt?" a boy asked, his voice a notch too loud. "Maybe," Bomani said softly. "Maybe not. She has to close the gap to within 30 meters for a successful strike. Anything beyond that, the math turns against her." The boy frowned. "Math?" Bomani nodded. "Predation isn't chaos. It's governed by probabilities, distance, angle of attack, wind direction, energy reserves. Every move you're watching is a calculation." The lioness yawned again, but this time her eyes were fully open, scanning the plains with a predator's algorithmic calm. And for a heartbeat, those eyes seemed to lock onto the cruiser. Not with hunger, humans weren't worth the risk, but with an awareness so ancient and clinical, it sent a ripple of cold through Bomani's chest. "Why's she looking at us like that?" The voice came from a man with ink crawling down his arm in serrated loops, the jagged black lines twisting like tectonic fractures over sun-browned skin. The patterns were Polynesian, traditional motifs reworked into something sharper, more modern, ancestry meeting the edge of violence. His name was Ashton Kekoa, born of the Pacific, and his presence carried the weight of it. He was broad-shouldered, his build more functional than ornamental, muscle layered from years of physical labor and the relentless push of salt water against bone. His hair, long and glossy, had been drawn back into a knot low on his head, strands clinging damp against the nape of his neck in the oppressive African heat. Sweat traced down his temples, catching in the faint stubble along his jaw. But his expression remained composed, almost unreadable. When he moved, it was with a kind of deliberate efficiency, a man trained to conserve energy until it mattered. There was no wasted gesture, no flourish, just purpose. He sat wedged beside Nick, his frame filling the open window, broad shoulders thrust forward like armor. The African sun caught the sweat on his forearms, igniting it in molten highlights that ran like quicksilver across taut muscle. Every few seconds his hands flexed against his thighs, slow, unconscious spasms, fingers curling and uncurling as though trying to bleed off static charge. Bomani noted it without turning. A nervous tell, one predator reading another. Ashton was the type who operated best in closed systems, gyms, bars, maybe a construction site, environments where variables could be controlled, outcomes managed. But this wasn't that world. This was chaos, old and perfect. Here, dominance hierarchies were written in teeth and velocity. Ashton's voice carried the tension of a man trying and failing to keep his center of gravity tight, gruff, stripped of humor. Bomani didn't answer immediately. He was still watching the lioness. The signals were there for anyone fluent in the code. The angle of her scapula, the flexion along the lumbar arc, the infinitesimal twitch of the tail tip slicing the air behind her, like a metronome counting down to something irrevocable. Behavior he understood. Behavior he could predict. "Because she can," he said finally, his voice flat. Then after a pause, "Rule number 1 out here? Never assume you're outside the system." The tourists fell silent. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the metallic scent of something Bomani didn't like. Something sharp, something wrong. He gripped the wheel tighter, and they continued on. The Land Cruiser nosed deeper into the thicket, its tires snapping brittle branches with gunshot cracks, the engine groaning as the vegetation clawed at the frame. Overhead, the canopy fractured the sunlight into broken geometry, mottled shards that slid across the hood in restless liquid patterns. The temperature shifted almost imperceptibly. The air felt denser now, humid, weighted, the kind of heat that clings rather than radiates. With it came a scent that didn't belong. Bomani noticed it first. The smell. It hit like an ambush, striking the back of his throat with a force that felt almost tactile, sweet, cloying. A rot that crawled past the nostrils into memory. A smell hardwired into the human hindbrain as a signal of danger. Behind it, the unmistakable iron tang of blood, faint yet undeniable, as if the very air had oxidized. Bomani's gut cinched tight. "Christ," Nick muttered from the back row, burying his face into the crook of his arm. His voice came out muffled, brittle. "What is that?" Bomani didn't answer. Not yet. Words wouldn't help. Words might even make it worse. Instead, he kept his eyes on the track ahead and ran probabilities in silence, building and collapsing mental models at speed. Poaching incident, predator kill, disease vector, something else. The smell thickened, layering itself into the air like a chemical fog, a miasma of volatile amines, putrescine, cadaverine, the byproducts of proteins unraveling at the molecular level. Bomani could almost taste it now, slick and metallic against his tongue, as if the atmosphere had been spiked with corrosion. Then came the sound. Not an animal, not speech, just the drone of wings. Insects. They told him the rest. As the cruiser pushed through the last curtain of brush, a black storm lifted, a sudden swirling cloud of flies erupting from the ground in a frenzy of noise and motion. They whirled above the hood, their bodies catching sunlight in glints of oily iridescence, then settled again in quivering blankets on whatever lay ahead. And then they saw the clearing. The world didn't just change, it inverted. It was as if they had driven through a membrane, crossed into a place where the rules Bomani trusted, thermodynamics, energy flow, the quiet algorithms of life, had collapsed into chaos. The smell rolled over them in a wave now, palpable, clinging. A smell that spoke in an ancient register no one could ignore. Something had died here, but not in any way Bomani had ever seen before. 2 white rhinos lay sprawled in the dust, their massive frames ruptured, their bulk defiled in ways Bomani had never seen in a decade of guiding. These weren't kills. They were desecrations. The first carcass lay on its side, flesh peeled back in long, deliberate ribbons, exposing the gleam of white bone beneath. The rib cage gaped open like a shattered cathedral, organs torn away in chunks that left ragged voids behind. Vultures circled in patient orbits above, waiting their turn in a hierarchy older than language. The second was worse. Its abdominal cavity had been gutted completely, entrails flung in looping arcs across the ground, glistening coils baking in the sun like obscene garlands. The smell coming off it was dense and greasy, clinging to the inside of the lungs. Bomani felt the breath hitch in his throat. He'd seen kills before, by lions, by hyenas, even by poachers when greed trumped decency. But this wasn't predation. It wasn't hunger. It was annihilation. "Oh my God," he whispered, though the words barely had shape. Courtney made a sound Bomani had only ever heard at funerals, a strangled note of grief torn out before words could form. Her hand shot to her mouth, eyes wide and glassy. Behind her, the kids froze in silent horror, their faces bleaching under the relentless light. Bomani said nothing. He was staring, his jaw locked, pulse drumming in his temples. Every neuron in his brain screamed against what his eyes confirmed. This wasn't lions. Lions eviscerated, yes, but with purpose, pattern. They opened the flank, worked through the viscera systematically, consumed soft tissue first. Hyenas? Hyenas fractured bones for marrow, left splintered remains, not surgical incisions like these. And these weren't just incisions. They were precise, deliberate. He forced himself to move his eyes, scanning the periphery with a cold clinical detachment born from years of field work, even as his pulse thudded in his ears. There were patterns, and they were wrong. No drag marks, no feeding hierarchy, no signs of sequential consumption. This wasn't energy flow. It was waste. And then he saw the third one. A juvenile, smaller, maybe a year old, slumped against the ravaged flank of its mother. Its hide was scored with deep lacerations, one wound punching clean through the shoulder girdle into the thoracic cavity. A puncture, Bomani noted automatically, circular, margins smooth as if cut by a tapered blade. But the blade had teeth. He could see where the edges of tissue were crushed, not sliced. The calf trembled, its breath a shallow flutter, the wet sound of pulmonary collapse audible even from here. It shifted weakly, nudging the motionless bulk of its mother, as if willing her to rise. The gesture broke something in Bomani. For an instant the world narrowed to that sound, a thin, high whimper, a plea carved from suffering, and the voided silence that answered. Bomani tore his eyes away. His hand found the CB mic by muscle memory, fingers slipping on the plastic, slick with sweat. He fumbled the frequency dial, the numbers swimming like heat mirages, until a burst of static flared in the speaker, a harsh, electric hiss, as if the air itself were burning. When he spoke, the words clawed out raw, stripped of pretense. "Hank, we've got a situation. Code 4. 2 dead rhinos, 1 injured. Juvenile. Coordinates 25 degrees, 41 minutes south, 31 degrees, 27 minutes east. Loveld savannah, just west of Kruger, outside Divigny." His throat constricted. He swallowed hard against the rising metallic taste in his mouth. "Get a team out here now. It's bad. Real bad." For a heartbeat, nothing but static, a whispering chaos of electrons. Then a voice cut through, brittle and clipped, freighted with protocol. Lions? Bomani stared at the clearing, eyes flicking over what he didn't want to see. The peeled musculature, the entrails slung in obscene arcs, the smooth puncture wounds bored deep into load-bearing anatomy. His brain spun out models, ran them forward, discarded them like faulty code. Lions didn't do this. Hyenas didn't do this. Crocodiles, poachers, scavenger collapse. None of it fit. The words that left his mouth were scarcely more than breath, dredged from a place beyond language, a hollow where certainty curdled into dread. "No," he said, "not lions." And even as the syllables hung in the hot insect-thick air, Bomani felt something colder than fear take root in his gut. A thought forming like frost on glass, sharp-edged and absolute. If it wasn't an African predator he knew, then it was something else, something new. And whatever was out there had just changed the rules. Suddenly a scream tore through the clearing, fracturing the silence like gears grinding against stripped teeth, high-pitched, primal. It wasn't just sound, it was instinct, weaponized, dredged from the deepest strata of the mammalian brain. Every living thing within earshot reacted as one. The tourists stiffened, flies scattered in a dark cloud, and Bomani's heart detonated in his chest. He spun in the driver's seat, hands slipping from the wheel. For a split second, his mind struggled to classify the sound. Lion, hyena, baboon. His instincts ran through the catalog like a field biologist riffling through flashcards. No. Wrong timbre, wrong cadence. It wasn't animal. It was human. But stripped bare of words, devoid of syntax, it hit the auditory cortex on a different register, something primitive, older than the cortex, older than consciousness itself. The sound bypassed higher cognition entirely, routed instead through the limbic system, that ancient circuitry of the brain hardwired for survival. It was the same neural reflex that had kept Homo erectus alive on the plains 2 million years ago. In the middle row, a woman was half standing, frozen in grotesque tableau. Her ponytail was pulled so tight it gleamed with sweat, strands already clinging to her forehead. Her face had gone chalk white, lips quivering as though the words she meant to form had been burned away before they could take shape. Her right arm jutted outward, rigid as a steel rod, finger stabbing toward the tree line. Her mouth opened, closed. A dry rasp escaped her throat. Not speech, but something closer to the stutter of a failing radio signal. "What is it?" her boyfriend hissed, gripping her arm, eyes darting between her and the dense scrub. She didn't answer, couldn't. The others noticed. In the confined space of the vehicle, tension spread like contagion, swift and invisible. Nervous chatter erupted all at once, questions overlapping with words of forced reassurance, each person reaching for an explanation to blunt the edge of the woman's scream. The effect was chaos. Too many voices, too many syllables reverberating in the metal shell of the truck. Bomani's instincts overrode everything else. He leaned forward, shoulders drawn tight, one finger pressed firmly to his lips. He exhaled a sharp, urgent shh. The signal was unmistakable, instinctive, and universal. Silence. Every muscle in his frame locked into stillness, the kind that came not from fear but from years of field work, from understanding how predators measured the world by vibration, by sound, by breath. Even his respiration shifted, shallow and precise, as if metered by an unseen metronome. He knew the savannah carried noise like a drumhead stretched taut. The atmosphere here was thin, the heat pressing it downward, amplifying each syllable, each footstep. A human voice pitched too high could carry for hundreds of meters, announcing their presence to anything with ears tuned to predation. He kept his eyes fixed on the tree line, but part of his mind broke the moment down analytically, the way a biologist or tracker would. Sound propagation in dry air, ambient humidity less than 15%, refractive waves off the baked earth distorting vision, making distance deceptive. All of it added up to one conclusion. They were exposed, fragile bodies in an open plain. Bomani lowered his hand slowly, each movement measured as though even the air had weight. His index finger, once pressed against his lips, drifted downward with surgical control. Nothing wasted, nothing careless. "Talk to me," he said, but it wasn't a plea. His voice was quiet, yes, but the edges were sharp, trimmed of comfort. The cadence had the rhythm of a command post, not a safari truck. He leaned forward just enough for the words to cut directly into her space, his eyes unblinking, locking onto hers as if sheer force of will might tether her scattered mind. Her pupils were dilated, fixed on some middle distance. Stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, still owned her nervous system. He could see it in the trembling of her jaw, in the way her chest rose and fell with shallow, irregular breaths. She wasn't hearing the words. Not yet. Bomani adjusted, lowering his tone a fraction. Less steel, more anchor. He knew from years in the bush that panic, like fire, needed oxygen. Deny it air, and it died. "What did you see?" His voice carried a scalpel's precision now, every syllable deliberate. "Look at me. Don't think about the shadows. Don't think about the trees. Focus here. Eyes on me. Tell me." The woman's throat worked once, twice, like she was trying to swallow glass. Her gaze flicked to him, pupils jittering. She blinked hard, a reflexive attempt to ground herself in the present. He waited, silent but unwavering, every nerve in his body alive to the savannah's stillness, the way sound carried, the way predators tuned themselves to the tremors of prey. "You saw something," Bomani pressed, softer now but no less insistent. His words were a controlled variable in the experiment of her fear. "Shape, size, movement. Give me anything." Her lips parted. No sound at first, just breath, then raw and uneven. It moved," she whispered, her voice cracking like overstressed metal. She clutched at her chest, forcing air into her lungs. "Something huge, in the trees." Bomani's jaw tightened. He said nothing, not yet. The words mattered less than the physiology, the tremor in her voice, the stress-induced quiver in her muscles. All of it spoke to truth. And truth was far more dangerous than hysteria. Then came the other sound. It cut through the heat and insect drone of the savannah, with an authority that erased everything else. Not a growl, not a bellow, something older. It wasn't like anything the tourists had ever heard before. Too deep for a lion, too resonant for an elephant. The frequency seemed to fold the air around it. The roar rolled across the clearing like a seismic wave. Bomani felt it before he truly heard it. Low-frequency vibrations crawling through the ground, up through the soles of his boots, hammering against his rib cage. His sternum reverberated like a struck tuning fork. The sound wasn't merely audible. It was tactile, invasive, alive. The tourists recoiled, as if struck by an unseen force, their bodies jerking in the same moment. Heads snapped toward the tree line, movements marionette-sharp, eyes wide and glassy in the shimmering heat. A few clutched their cell phones or cameras, useless talismans in a world where evolutionary memory was suddenly screaming at them to run. Bomani's own pulse spiked, but he forced his body still. Instinct told him to freeze, conserve motion, listen. His mind catalogued automatically. Decibels, resonance, the way the frequency lingered in the air longer than it should. This wasn't atmospheric distortion. This was biology. Vocal cords, massive ones, amplifying sound through a chest cavity that had to be meters wide. A larynx engineered for dominance. Ashton broke the silence, his voice already collapsing under the weight of something primal. "What the hell was that?" he stammered. The words fractured in his throat, stripped of all pretense of bravado. It was the voice of a man reduced to his oldest wiring: fight, flight, freeze, stripped of civilization, left only with the raw, quivering animal beneath. Bomani didn't answer. He was staring past the tree line, pupils constricting against the glare. Every instinct in his body screamed the same thing his father had drilled into him since boyhood. When the bush goes silent, the earth is already speaking. Listen with your feet, then run before it calls your name. The words reverberated inside him, not as memory, but as command. And still something held him frozen for half a second, the same gravitational pull that kept sailors staring at the rising wall of a tidal wave, hypnotized by its terrible majesty, even as it consigned them to oblivion. The baby rhino bleated weakly, ears flicking, then bolted into the brush with a clumsy gait, vanishing into a tangle of foliage. And then Bomani saw it. A shadow uncoiled between the fever trees, their pale trunks stark against the wavering heat. At first it was only a distortion, a ripple in the light, subtle, deliberate. Then a leg broke free of the mirage, enormous. Corded muscle shifted beneath taut, scaly integument, each fiber contracting with mechanical precision. It stepped forward like a machine built of flesh, hydraulic in its control. The ground yielded, soil split under the weight, grains scattering as the padded foot splayed, pressing deep into the earth. Loose dirt fanned outward in cascading sheets, the way sand spills from a collapsing dune. Another step. Then it emerged fully into the clearing, and for a moment, time fractured into disbelief. It stood nearly 4 meters at the shoulder, 7 meters from snout to tail tip, a bipedal colossus sculpted for pursuit. Its skull was a wedge of bone and sinew, nearly 60 centimeters long, deep-set with forward-facing eyes that burned with an uncanny intelligence. Above the eyes rose 2 thick horns, keratin-sheathed ridges arcing like the prongs of a living bull, giving the creature its name. Its forelimbs were vestigial stubs, each ending in 2 clawed digits. But its hind limbs were immense, thighs bulging with type 2 muscle fibers, engineered by evolution for explosive speed. And the color. Bomani noted it without meaning to. A mottled pattern of charcoal and ochre, perfect for breaking up its outline among shadows and scrub. Cryptic coloration. The creature lowered its head, nostrils flaring, drawing in the scent of blood and rot. Its jaw opened, revealing conical teeth, 30 of them, each blade curved, some serrated along the trailing edge for maximum tissue damage. Blood clung to the interdental spaces in dark filaments. Nick froze with his camera halfway to his eye, mind hammering against a wall of denial. The name detonated in his skull like a depth charge. Carnotaurus. He had seen the skeletal mounts in museums, read the captions in paleontology journals. Late Cretaceous predator, Patagonia, 70 million years extinct. Average weight, 1.5 metric tons. Estimated running speed, 60 kilometers an hour. Bite force? Lower than a tyrannosaur's, but more than enough to kill. None of that mattered now. The reconstructions, the journal captions, The diagrams, academic abstractions, all of them, because this was real, living, breathing. Each inhalation expanded a rib cage the size of a wine barrel, the sound a deep rush of air like a forge being stoked. And it was moving toward them, not with the loping grace of a mammal, but with a rolling, reptilian gait, each step a transfer of mass that set muscle bundles rippling under armored hide. The movement was unnervingly precise, like an organic machine coming online after eons of silence, every fiber tuned for power, every joint engineered by evolution for predation. "Dear Lord," Courtney whispered. Her voice was almost reverent, like a prayer cracked in half. The Carnotaurus swung its head toward the land cruiser, horns catching the sun in quick metallic flashes. The ridges of bone above its skull glimmered like weapons forged for war, its pupils cinched into predators' crosshairs, avian, cold, calibrated for depth and motion. Then it exhaled. The blast erupted from cavernous lungs with the force of a ruptured boiler. The air came hot, violent, and wet, carrying a pressure shock that seemed to push the atmosphere itself. The stench followed an instant later, so dense it was almost visible, a noxious wall of chemical warfare born on exhalation. It hit like impact trauma, a layered assault, the sweet-sour reek of putrefaction, the metallic sting of hemoglobin, the acrid bite of ruptured tissue, oxidizing in the heat. Threaded through it was methane, unmistakable, produced by colonies of anaerobic bacteria digesting carrion deep within the alimentary canal. A molecular signature as old as decomposition itself, the byproduct of microbial ecosystems thriving inside a living predator. This was not the odor of passive decay. It was the chemical residue of active predation of an apex carnivore fresh from feeding, its digestive system still processing the evidence. The tourists reacted in unison, throats seized, stomachs convulsed, eyes watered in reflex as cameras dipped, binoculars sagged, and hands came up instinctively, palms futilely pressed against mouths and noses. But there was no defense. The cloud was everywhere, an omnipresent signal encoded by evolution to trigger a single universal response. Instinct recoiled. Every fiber of their bodies understood what the conscious mind could not yet articulate. This was a warning. Then it hissed. The sound was not merely auditory, it was physical. A vibration thick with infrasound, resonant at the threshold of human perception, rolled outward from the predator, like an acoustic shockwave. It crawled beneath the skin, made bones hum in sympathy, set teeth buzzing in their sockets. The frequency climbed through the sternum, inflating the rib cage with a tremor that felt internal, as though the body had been repurposed into an instrument of terror. Bomani knew the mechanics. Low-frequency communication was a biological weapon. Tigers used it to stun prey. Crocodiles bellowed with infrasonic pressure that could be felt through water as much as heard in air. Elephants carried their rumbles for kilometers, vibrations coursing invisibly through the ground. In each case, the effect was evolutionary efficiency, long-range communication, intimidation, control. But this was something else. Orders of magnitude stronger, a frequency engineered by deep time itself. The hiss tunneled into the brain's primitive structures, bypassing higher cognition and striking directly at the amygdala. It activated the circuitry of survival where fear lived unfiltered, raw, indivisible. The binary equation of life, fight or flight, collapsed in an instant. There was no fight, only flight. Nick's fingers spasmed, the camera convulsing in his grip. A staccato burst of shutter clicks erupted, each frame snatching a frozen fragment of horror, even as reality blurred forward with accelerating momentum. The predator lunged. Its mass came forward in a blur of muscle and inertia, talons gouging the soil, momentum translating into raw, terrifying velocity. "Hold on!" Bomani roared, slamming the transmission into gear. The cruiser leapt forward with a metallic shriek. Rear tires tore at the dirt, spitting gouts of loam and stone in high arcs as rubber clawed for grip. For an instant, traction slipped, the vehicle shuddering, fishtailing, but then torque caught. Power surged through the drivetrain, hammering across the chassis. Every bone in their bodies felt the impact, a vibration that rattled teeth, compressed joints, and sent a shock through spinal cords. Behind them, the Carnotaurus exploded into motion. Forward momentum came not from grace but from force, its body hammering itself ahead in percussive bursts. The impacts sent tremors through the topsoil, vibrations Bomani could feel humming in the steering column. Dust and pebbles leapt with every strike, the ground itself protesting the load. Its tail, thick as an I-beam and nearly the length of a compact car, whipped laterally in wide arcs, an organic gyroscope stabilizing the bulk of its body. Each oscillation corrected micro-imbalances in gait, allowing the predator to maintain efficiency even as it accelerated. The gap closed with impossible speed. "Jesus Christ, it's fast!" Ashton screamed, the sound grotesquely high-pitched, bravado stripped to nothing, terror pulling him back through millennia of evolution to something small and helpless. Bomani didn't answer. He couldn't. His focus had narrowed to a tunnel, the wheel a living thing in his hands as he fought to keep the vehicle aligned through the undergrowth. Saplings shattered under the bumper, branches raked the windshield in white scars. The GPS on the dash flickered as vibrations scrambled its sensors. Speedometer, 48, 52, 58 kilometers per hour. The Carnotaurus was matching it, stride for stride. Its jaws snapped shut just meters from the tailgate, the sound like steel bear traps slamming shut, teeth shearing air where Nick's head had been seconds before. The tourists screamed, a single undifferentiated wail of primal terror. Courtney was sobbing. Jamal was praying in fragments. Ashton clung to the seat frame, his knuckles bone white. Bomani jammed the accelerator to the floor, feeling the engine claw for every last ounce of horsepower. The cruiser bucked like a machine at the edge of failure, tires spitting mud as they punched through a curtain of thorn scrub. But in the mirror, the predator was still there, still closing. Its movements were grotesquely fluid, a paradox of mass and grace. Each stride converted raw tonnage into velocity with terrifying efficiency, ligaments stretching, tendons recoiling like high-tension cables, muscle groups firing in mechanical synchronicity. This was biomechanics stripped to essentials, a predator refined not by design, but by the relentless sieve of natural selection, 66 million years in the making. Extinction had ended the experiment, freezing it in limestone and petrified strata, sealing it behind glass panels and Latin captions. And yet here it was, impossible and undeniable. The experiment restarted, as if geologic time had been rewound, reanimating an apex blueprint long since abandoned by the living world. Bomani's mind flickered with a single thought, sharp and cold as a scalpel blade. This should not exist. And yet it did. The Carnotaurus lunged again, its jaws clamped shut a breath behind the rear bumper, teeth cleaving through empty air with the force of a hydraulic press. The impact generated a concussive crack that tore through the clearing, a sonic geometry of terror. The roar followed instantly, a guttural detonation that seemed to rip the atmosphere itself into shreds. The cruiser shuddered beneath the acoustic assault, every bolt in the chassis rattling as though the machine itself felt fear. "Faster!" Ashton screamed. "We're maxed!" Bomani snapped, voice ragged. Somewhere deep in the tree line, birds erupted into a screaming vortex, fleeing the corridor of destruction as the past thundered across the present. The Land Cruiser tore through the scrub like a wounded animal, its chassis convulsing over jagged ground, shocks screaming under the abuse. Branches lashed the windows in a blur of green and brown, shattering into splinters that rained across the hood. The air inside was electric with panic. Ragged breaths, sobs, the metallic clatter of loose gear ricocheting across the floor. Bomani's knuckles were bone white on the wheel. Instinct had taken over. Pure motor commands executed in fractions of seconds, bypassing conscious thought. He wrenched the wheel hard right, sending the vehicle plunging off the main track into an assault of dense underbrush. The gamble worked. For a heartbeat. Behind them, the predator faltered. Its massive bulk crashed through the saplings, a juggernaut slowed by the sudden entropy of uneven terrain. Its tail scythed laterally, gouging a trench in the soil as it fought for balance. The head dipped low, jaws snapping in reflexive fury. Then it righted itself with terrifying speed, hind limbs pistoning beneath its weight in a blur of tendon and contracting muscle. The recovery was instantaneous, as if inertia itself had no claim on the animal. For a creature tipping the scale at several tons, the efficiency of motion was obscene, a living engine translating mass into acceleration with almost mechanical precision. Its hiss followed, slicing across the clearing. Not a simple exhalation, but a guttural detonation of sound driven through a throat the size of a drain pipe, vocal cords vibrating at frequencies that bled into the infrasonic. The blast carried a depth that bypassed the ear, penetrating tissue, vibrating marrow, rattling the architecture of bone. "Shit! It's on our ass!" Ashton screamed, his voice a splintered octave above reason. Bomani didn't answer. His brain was parsing probabilities, none of them good. He jammed the throttle, engine screaming toward redline, as the cruiser bucked like a bronco under the assault of hidden roots and unseen ruts. Every jolt threatened to shear the suspension from its mounts. The tourists clung to whatever they could, seat frames, grab bars, each other, knuckles blanching as centrifugal forces whipped them side to side. Courtney pressed her face into Jamal's shoulder, sobs breaking in ragged bursts that tore at her throat. Her fingernails dug in hard, crescent-shaped welts blooming red against his skin, pain overridden by sheer panic. Nick's DSLR swung from its strap in violent arcs, a pendulum gone berserk. The lens smashed against the doorframe with a crystalline report, glass splintering into a spray of glittering fragments. The shards rattled across the floorboards like spent shell casings as the cruiser lurched over a ridge. The suspension bottomed out with a metallic shriek, shock absorbers compressing to their limit before recoiling, hammering vertebrae and rattling every bone in their bodies. The interior had become a centrifuge of panic and physics, every movement amplified, every breath edged with terror. And then the beast was beside them, resurrected flesh running parallel to modern steel, Mesozoic and machine, racing together across African earth. Extinction and survival, neck and neck. Its head swung into view, close enough for its shadow to wash over the cruiser like a moving eclipse, a triangular battering ram of bone, armored in scales the color of rusted iron. The horns slashed forward like the prongs of a charging bull, keratin sheaths glinting under the sun, weapons sharpened by evolutionary necessity. Blood clung to the crenellated ridges along its jaws, dried into blackened crusts that cracked and flaked with every motion. Between them, teeth as long as steak knives jutted downward, recurved and serrated. Each was a cutting tool driven by jaw muscles, capable of exerting thousands of pounds of force per square inch. A precision machine honed for predation. Its exhalations blasted through the open windows in searing gusts, a chemical stink of sulfur and carbon. The metallic tang of digested protein was unmistakable, but beneath it lingered something far more caustic, the acrid sting of ammonia, gaseous byproduct of nitrogen waste vented from deep in the gut. It carried the unmistakable signature of decomposition, like the breath of an open grave, an odor that bypassed reason and struck directly at the brainstem, triggering reflexive recoil in every human inside the vehicle. The Carnotaurus matched their speed easily, running on hind limbs that drove like hydraulic actuators, converting mass into forward momentum with ruthless efficiency. Bomani caught fragments of its anatomy in the strobing blur of motion, flexor tendons tensing and releasing like tensioned bowstrings, gastrocnemius muscles ballooning and collapsing beneath the hide with each explosive thrust. "Hang on to something!" Bomani roared, voice shredding in his throat as he saw the predator pivot. And then it struck. The impact was catastrophic. The Carnotaurus drove its skull into the cruiser's flank with the velocity of a demolition charge. Bone and horn met steel in a transfer of kinetic energy measured in thousands of joules, the sheer tonnage behind it converting mass and speed into devastation. Metal screamed in protest, crumpling inward as stress radiated in white-hot fissures, the molecular lattice of steel yielding past tolerance. The entire vehicle lurched sideways, momentum levering it up onto two wheels. For a heartbeat, the Land Cruiser became a physics experiment, Newton's laws fighting for supremacy. Gravity pulled down, inertia dragged sideways, suspension coils compressed to their limits, and shrieked as the vehicle hung on the cusp of rollover. Inside, chaos detonated. Loose equipment became airborne ordnance. Canteens, cameras, splintered glass whirled in zero-G arcs across the cabin. Passengers were flung like rag dolls, torsos slamming against restraints, limbs colliding in sickening impacts. Courtney's forehead struck a steel rail with a wet, resonant thunk. Jamal's phone ricocheted against the roof and shattered, glass erupting in a glittering spray like shrapnel under fluorescent light. Lungs convulsed as breath ripped free in terrified bursts, the cabin a maelstrom of bodies and broken air. And then gravity reasserted itself. The cruiser slammed back down, all four tires hammering earth with a concussion that rattled fillings. Dust geysered skyward in ochre plumes, metal shrieked under the recoil, frame twisting, bolts straining, fatigue lines spiderwebbing unseen across the chassis. The suspension bottomed out, rebounded, and for a split second, the vehicle felt less like transport than wreckage held together by momentum alone. In the chaos, the oldest passenger, Richard, 73, retired physician, lost his grip. His fingers slipped from the grab rail, tendons overstretched, friction giving way to physics. The centrifugal force flung him sideways, just as the door buckled on a compromised hinge. For a single heartbeat, he hung there in the aperture, body silhouetted against a kaleidoscope of green, a marionette suspended in a theater of sunlight and trees. Then he was gone. The forest swallowed him in a blur of color and motion, gravity yanking him earthward with merciless acceleration. He hit the ground with a sound Bomani would never forget, a wet, concussive crack that carried the finality of anatomical failure. Bone yielded before muscle. The tibia and fibula splintered instantly, brittle struts snapping under torsional load. The femur, thickest, strongest bone in the human body, shattered on impact, fragments shearing through quadriceps like jagged glass through clay. Richard screamed. It was not the voice of a man, but of a mammal, stripped of language and reason. A high, animal keening tore through the thunder of the engine and the shriek of stressed metal, a frequency that bypassed thought and detonated pure terror in everyone who heard it. "Stop! We have to!" a woman cried, her words strangled by hysteria, already reaching for the latch. "No!" Bomani barked, eyes locked on the rearview mirror. His tone cracked like a rifle shot. "We can't!" Because in the mirror, framed against the rolling dust plume, the Carnotaurus was already veering. Its hind limbs tore at the ground, talons plowing furrows 1/2 meter deep as loam and stone fountained outward. The massive tail swung in a stabilizing arc, counterbalancing several tons of momentum with the precision of an engineered pendulum. Its skull pivoted with the accuracy of a weapon system locking on target. Then the jaws yawned wide, a cathedral of living architecture, red muscle banded like cables under tension, ivory teeth recurved and serrated, each one a blade built to pierce, hold, and rend. A geometry perfected by natural selection for a single purpose: to kill. Richard's scream wavered into words, the syllables fractured by panic. "Help me! Dear God, help me!" And then the predator struck. It slammed its foot down onto Richard's pelvis and spine. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The weight of nearly 2 tons, focused through taloned digits, acted like an industrial compactor. Vertebrae burst apart, their trabecular cores collapsing into splinters under compressive load, while the ilium cracked along fault lines like fired pottery dropped on stone. The impact pulped the lumbar musculature in an instant, shearing through fascial planes and rupturing major vessels, the iliac arteries and veins torn open, dumping blood into a cavity already filling with bone fragments. The sacrum disintegrated, splintering into shards that punctured bowel loops, releasing a sudden fetor of ruptured intestine. The collapse cascaded upward. Lumbar vertebrae failed in sequence, their articular facets popping like overstrained rivets. The spinal cord sheared into ribbons. Nerve conduction ceased below the impact point, motor function gone in an instant. Richard's lower body was meat, nothing more. Blood jetted from his mouth in a violent arterial spray, propelled not only by trauma but by the hydraulic compression of his thoracic cavity. Air and fluid were forced upward through the trachea, a grotesque pump action that expelled a froth of crimson and pulmonary surfactant. The spray misted across the ochre soil, stippling the ground in droplets that shimmered under the African sun. Instinct overrode paralysis. Richard's arms thrashed against the earth, nails clawing shallow furrows through the dust, as though raw traction alone could drag him away from inevitability. His palms struck rock and root with useless force, skin peeling in ragged crescents as he scrabbled forward. The nervous system, already compromised by massive spinal trauma, fired its final chaotic volleys. Severed axons misfired, motor neurons sparked without order, and the result was a grotesque parody of movement. Limbs twitching in asynchronous spasms, muscles contracting and releasing in meaningless sequence. His body had become a battlefield of misfiring circuits, the desperate chatter of a brain still issuing commands to a system that no longer responded. Each convulsion looked like intent, like effort, but it was nothing more than chaos, an organism unraveling in real time. The Carnotaurus arched downward, cervical vertebrae flexing in a smooth biomechanical chain. Each joint rotated in sequence, distributing the load with terrifying efficiency. Tendons stretched taut along the neck like anchor cables under strain, the kinetic energy transferring seamlessly into the lowering of the skull. The head dipped into strike position, and the jaws yawned open. The gape was obscene, exceeding 100 degrees, far beyond the mechanical limits of any modern predator. Serrated teeth jutted from the alveolar bone in recurved arcs. Their enamel glistened under the sun, wet with saliva, and streaked with the black-red residue of prior kills. Interdental spacing created a natural trap. Once something entered, escape was biologically impossible. Every component was purposeful. The masseter muscles bulged along the jawline. Bundles of striated fibers evolved to contract with explosive power. The quadrate bone at the hinge allowed for wide, crushing leverage, distributing a bite force measured at over 40,000 newtons, enough to shatter cortical bone in milliseconds. Even the tongue, thick and muscular, bristled with keratinized papillae that could rasp flesh into paste once trapped inside. Richard tried to scream as the jaws clamped down over his chest and skull. The sound never formed. The attempt collapsed into a wet rasp, air forced through shredded bronchial passages as both lungs ruptured into useless sacks of tissue. The predator's bite transmitted thousands of pounds of force in a single instant, the thoracic cavity collapsing like a pressurized hull breach. Organs that moments before sustained life were compressed into a homogenized pulp of viscera. His eyes bulged grotesquely, engorged by the sudden spike in intracranial pressure. Cerebrospinal fluid surged as the cranium itself began to deform under the compressive load. Cranial sutures strained to their limits, the seams between skull plates shifting fractions of a millimeter before fracturing. Tiny cracks spidered through bone, radiating outward in branching fault lines, as if the skull itself were shattering glass. At the same time, the ribcage failed catastrophically. Ribs splintered en masse, a staccato cascade of sharp reports that sounded almost industrial, like kindling snapping underfoot. Several ribs tore free entirely, jagged ends driven inward. They punched through both lungs, shredding alveolar tissue and lacerating pulmonary arteries before spearing into the myocardium itself. The heart wall tore open, releasing a fresh surge of pressurized blood into the cavity, the jets erupting in pulsing bursts with each failing contraction. The diaphragm ruptured, collapsing upward, forcing more blood and air out through the windpipe in a spray of froth. Blood atomized into the open air, a crimson haze suspended in sunlight. Droplets, propelled by the pressure of arterial rupture, fanned outward in a grotesque parabola. Leaves and stems nearby became canvases, stippled with scarlet mist in chaotic patterns, each droplet a forensic marker of catastrophic trauma. The smell of iron and ruptured viscera flooded the clearing. The predator's jaws worked methodically, serrated teeth sawing through flesh and bone with mechanical inevitability. Each shear drove deeper, slicing through costal cartilage before reaching the vertebral column. The spine resisted only briefly, then the vertebrae separated with a nauseating pop, intervertebral discs rupturing, their gelatinous cores spraying outward as the spinal cord tore apart like frayed electrical cable. The effect was instantaneous. Richard's body convulsed violently, not from conscious will, but from a final misfire of severed neural pathways. Muscles contracted in chaotic sequence, limbs jerking outward in a grotesque seizure as the central nervous system blinked into silence. In less than a heartbeat, the architecture of life had been dismantled. Skeletal structure, neural conduction, and vital organs undone by teeth evolved to do nothing else. For a moment, his lower body remained grotesquely attached, snapped back into a hyperextension no human spine was built to endure. The pelvis and legs flailed uselessly, tethered to the ruined upper torso by bands of fascia and tendon stretched past all physiological tolerance. Those fibers strained under torque, standing out like pale cords against the red backdrop of torn muscle. They began to fail. One by one they parted in rapid sequence, each snapping with the sharp report of overstressed cables under load. Sheets of connective tissue peeled away, elastic resilience giving way to catastrophic rupture. Vessels tore with them, releasing sudden arterial jets that spattered the ochre soil in crimson fans. Only a few sinews remained, quivering under the predator's leverage. Then the Carnotaurus wrenched its skull upwards with violent force. The last fibers tore in unison, a wet, fibrous rip, and the body came apart. Richard was torn in half. His upper torso remained clamped in the predator's jaws, viscera spilled free in a rope of glistening intestines, the coils unspooling from the abdominal cavity like a severed hose line. They hit the ground with a wet smack, mucosal sheaths glistening in the sunlight, already dusted with ochre soil, while the lower half toppled into the dust with a heavy boneless thud. Blood pooled quickly, soaking earth and leaf litter, the bifurcated remains already unrecognizable as human. Segments of liver tumbled loose, dark and gelatinous, ruptured lobes leaking bile. Shredded fragments of stomach lining dangled from the breach, dripping half-digested slurry, while jagged shards of rib and fragmented vertebrae jutted outward from the ruin of the torso like shrapnel. The predator lifted the upper half high, cervical tendons flexing as the skull arced skyward. The body dangled in its jaws like a butcher's carcass, limbs twitching reflexively, even as blood streamed down in long vermilion ribbons. Droplets struck the earth in rhythmic succession, a grisly percussion of impact. The pattern was almost metronomic, arterial remnants cascading in a steady downpour, like a bloody rain, soaking the dust until it clumped in sticky red mud. Then it turned. With a violent wrench of its skull, the Carnotaurus vanished into the tree line, dragging the ruined upper half of its prey into the abyss. The undergrowth swallowed it whole, branches whipping and snapping as if recoiling from the intrusion. What remained behind was aftermath. A broad smear of blood striped across the ochre dust, the fluid darkening as hemoglobin oxidized in the heat. Segments of intestine lay coiled in the dirt like discarded serpents, peristaltic motion still fluttering faintly along their length as steam lifted in ghostly tendrils. The African sun baked them dry in seconds, turning glistening coils into shriveling tubes of tissue. Loops of mesentery clung stubbornly to the shattered lower torso, pale ribbons of connective tissue stretched taut across splintered bone. They twitched in irregular spasms, the last chaotic firings of a nervous system that no longer existed. Shards of pelvis jutted upward through the ruin, ivory spears protruding from a lattice of red pulp. Beneath it all, bile and gastric fluid pooled in a slick yellow-green smear. The stench was acrid, chemical, overlaying the metallic tang of spilled blood with a sharper burn that stung the sinuses. The scent carried instantly, a volatile signature of death. The flies arrived almost immediately, as though summoned. They descended in black buzzing clouds, crawling across the steaming remains, wings catching the sun in iridescent flashes. Their collective hum filled the silence, a grotesque chorus announcing that nature had already begun its reclamation. And then there was silence, an unnatural silence, dense and suffocating, pressing down like added weight in the air. The only sounds were internal, the metallic hammer of Bomani's pulse in his ears, the ragged broken sobbing from the back seats. Everything else had stopped. It was the silence that follows an earthquake, the stunned pause when the earth itself seems to draw breath, registering the violence that has just ripped through it. Sound had not merely faded, it had been extinguished. Even the birds were mute, their calls cut short as if some deeper instinct warned against breaking the stillness. The canopy above loomed in spectral quiet, a vaulted darkness where something older, something catastrophic, had just passed. The forest broke suddenly, spitting them into the raw glare of open savannah. The land cruiser burst through the last wall of undergrowth in an eruption of leaves and dust, the chassis groaning as the suspension absorbed the impact. The engine howled, pistons hammering at red line, while Bomani fought the wheel with white-knuckled hands, forcing the vehicle onto firmer ground. His breath came in ragged bursts, lungs burning, the metallic tang of adrenaline thick on his tongue as if he were sucking on copper. Inside, nobody spoke. The cabin was filled only with the sound of respiration, fast, shallow inhalations edged with the dry rasp of shock. Sweat slicked foreheads and dampened collars, evaporating almost instantly in the superheated air. Pupils remained dilated, fixed in the aftermath of sympathetic overdrive, each passenger locked in the biochemical prison of fight or flight, with nowhere for the energy to go. They sat rigid in their seats, eyes wide, staring at nothing. Neural pathways looped endlessly, replaying what had just happened in fragments of image and sound. Blood on ochre earth, the scream cut short, the flicker of horns and teeth flashing past the window. Each was trapped in a private feedback loop of fear, unable to break the cycle, unable to accept the silence that followed. Bomani's hands gripped the wheel so tightly the tendons stood out like braided cables beneath his skin. Knuckles blanched, joints rigid, the circulation throttled by sheer force of effort. Sweat ran in bright rivulets down his temple, cutting channels through the ochre dust plastered to his face. His vision had narrowed into a tunnel, the horizon locked dead ahead, every flicker of peripheral movement ignored by a brain still overloaded with adrenaline. His lungs dragged in air like bellows, stoking a dying fire, each inhalation raw, shallow, insufficient. He had seen lions dismantle buffalo, muscles sawing through hide while the air filled with the sound of cartilage breaking. He had seen elephants crush poachers with terrifying accuracy, tusks piercing torsos, ribs caving in with the efficiency of a bone saw. He had seen death painted in every shade the savannah could provide, blood on sand, bones bleaching under the sun, carcasses unraveling into the ecosystem. But nothing like that. They had survived, barely. Survival, in this context, was a technicality, no more than a statistical outlier, a grace period afforded by luck rather than control. Deep down, Bomani knew the truth. Survival was an illusion, a temporary state measured in minutes or seconds. This wasn't an encounter. It was an opening act. The curtain had only just risen, and whatever followed would be worse, larger in scope, more catastrophic in scale. Evolutionary history had been set back in motion, and humanity, fragile and unadapted, had stumbled blindly into its path. In the back seat, Nick was hunched over his camera like a conspirator guarding stolen evidence. The DSLR rocked against his knees as his hands trembled, knuckles slick with sweat. He scrolled through the playback in jerky, uneven motions, each flick of his thumb exposing another fragment of nightmare rendered permanent. every frame stabbed at his brain, bypassing denial, drilling into the cortex with the precision of a biopsy needle. There was no way to rationalize pixels. The lens had no imagination, no capacity for error. It had seen and it had captured, and now the evidence existed, undeniable. There it was, frame after frame, captured in brutal, unflinching clarity. Horns caught the sun like forged metal, glinting in sharp flashes, jaws arrested mid-lunge, serrated teeth locked in arcs of crimson, each tooth recurved and gleaming as though engineered for violence. The eyes were worst of all, pupils contracted into voids, calibrated for motion, depth, and distance. The cold optics of a predator evolved to lock and pursue. Each still was a fossilized instant, a digital specimen pinned in place like an insect beneath glass. Proof, immutable and indifferent, preserved not in stone strata, but in memory cards, silicon layers recording what human cognition could not fully accept. And Nick knew, as he scrolled, that these images would outlive him. They were too precise, too undeniable, preserved in the digital record that would remain long after he was gone. His stomach turned. These weren't photographs. They were indictments, proof that the natural order had been violated, that extinction itself was no longer a boundary. Each frame was evidence in a trial the world hadn't convened yet. And no one was going to believe them. Not the rangers, bound by procedure and chain of command. Not the government, shackled to politics, budgets, and plausible deniability. Not anyone still tethered to a world where rules mattered, where evolution moved forward in a straight line, never backward. The camera in his hands wasn't a tool anymore. It was a weapon, and he wasn't sure which side of it he stood on. Nick stared at the glow bleeding from the display, the light washing his face in spectral hues. Every image stared back at him with the permanence of evidence, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to cradle heresy, a truth so violent it could shear reality in half. These were not pictures. They were fractures in the narrative of the modern world. Behind him, the forest whispered. Branches shifted with the weight of something moving, far too quietly for a creature of that mass. It was the kind of sound evolution had trained mammals to hear, a near silence that prickled the skin, broadcasting danger through absence rather than presence. The land itself seemed complicit. This place, the ancient crucible of life and death, had peeled back its veneer and revealed something raw, something terrifying. An organism without claim to the 21st century, no business intruding into a world of concrete, glass, electricity, and technology. It belonged to another order of time altogether, one not measured by human calendars or dynasties, but by epochs, vast spans recorded only in strata of stone and ash, in fossilized bone compressed into rock. It was the biology of a vanished world, reinserted violently into the present, carrying with it the full weight of an era when survival was dictated not by infrastructure or governance, but by pure evolutionary pressure. And now there was no turning back. A threshold had been crossed, silent, invisible, but absolute. The illusion of extinction, comforting, unquestioned, written into textbooks as immutable fact, lay in ruins. In its place stood a truth far older, one etched into the fossil record and carved into every vein of the earth. Survival was never permanent, dominion never guaranteed. Humanity had mistaken itself for the apex, the presumed end product of evolution, rather than a temporary participant in its ongoing lottery. It had constructed cities of circuitry and steel, stretched fences across savannas, written laws and borders onto maps, launched satellites into orbit. All of its scaffolding designed to create distance from the natural world. But insulation was not immunity. None of it mattered now. Evolution cared nothing for treaties or technology. It recognized only adaptation and failure. The hierarchy could shift. It always had. The fossil record was a ledger of vanished rulers: trilobites, eurypterids, gorgonopsids, pterosaurs, pliosaurs, dinosaurs, mammoths. Each had dominated in its time, commanding oceans, skies, or continents. Each had reigned for millions of years, entire ecosystems bent around their supremacy. And each had been erased, wiped away not by malice but by forces indifferent to their existence. Climate change, impact events, continental drift, pathogens. Extinction was not anomaly. It was pattern. It was the rule, written in the geological record like scripture, etched into compacted shale and limestone, a library of loss. Every stratum carried the same story. The rulers of one age became the foundation of the next. Fossilized bone turned to mineral, bodies pressed into rock, the dead literally fueling the rise of what came after. And now that same pattern was shifting again. And when the shift came, it was never gradual. It was sudden, it was brutal, and it was final. The illusion had shattered, and with it the fragile conviction that human supremacy was secure. Civilization's armor, its cities, its machines, its walls of law and order, suddenly seemed thin, brittle, cosmetic. They were scaffolds, not shields. What remained was exposure. 8 billion primates, abruptly vulnerable, thrust back into a contest as ancient as predator and prey. Evolution operated without referees, without exceptions, without mercy. Natural selection cared nothing for intelligence or tools, for architecture or medicine. It measured only adaptation, only response to pressure. The winners endured, the losers vanished. Again and again, ecosystems had been reset, their rulers replaced by organisms better suited to survive in a changing world. Humanity had believed itself exempt. It had built a narrative of permanence, told itself that technology insulated it from the primitive struggle. But the rules had never changed. They had only been forgotten. And now the dice had been thrown back onto the table of deep time. The unsettling truth was this: extinction had always been the baseline. The fossil record was not a record of survival. It was a cemetery, a ledger of failure. 99% of all species that had ever lived were gone, their traces sealed in stone. The biosphere itself was transient. And now, the processes that had consigned them to oblivion were stirring again. Subtle, pervasive, indifferent. Viruses mutating faster than vaccines could be made, forests collapsing into savannah, ice melting, seas acidifying, pathogens jumping across species barriers with lethal efficiency. Which meant only one thing: something had changed. The equilibrium that it held, fragile, contingent, temporary, was unraveling. And beneath that unraveling moved something older, something vast. Evolution did not sleep. It did not stop. In the darkness, in hidden reservoirs of forest and ocean, in genetic fragments preserved in bone and amber, processes older than the human species were advancing, indifferent to the illusions of mastery. The game was no longer theoretical, no longer confined to fossil strata and museum displays. It was happening now. In laboratories where gene editing blurred the line between extinction and innovation, in jungles where new predators slipped through undergrowth unrecorded by science, in the bloodstream of animals carrying ancient codes awakened after eons of dormancy. And humanity was about to discover that the dice were already in play.